You want honesty?
I was never supposed to feel any of this. That was the agreement. You broke it first.
I know. I know I did.
Throats.
You knew this was never just an arrangement. You knew that before I did.
Knowing something and being ready for it are not the same thing.
If you walk out of this restaurant, I will burn every gallery in Seoul until I find you. His voice was not loud. That was the worst part. Amara turned slowly. Her coat was already on, her bag already on her shoulder. She had counted the steps to the door, 11. And now she was standing at 8, and Sungmin was behind her. And the street outside the window was glittering and completely indifferent. She turned around. He looked like a man who had never once in his life said something he did not mean. She believed him. That was the problem. You don't own me. No. Something crossed his face. Raw, unguarded, gone before she could name it. But I'm asking you to stay anyway. Welcome back, Wild Hearts. If you've been here, you know we don't do love that comes easy. We do love that costs everything. Your plan, your safety, your carefully built life. And if you're new, you just walked in at the right moment. Because this is the story of a woman who sat down across from a stranger in a Gangnam restaurant to help him, just to help him, and ended up holding something she never planned for, with two dangerous men who were never supposed to feel anything. Hit like if you're staying. Subscribe because some stories don't ask permission. They just begin. Now, let's go back to where it all started. 4 months earlier. A restaurant in Gangnam, and a woman who almost didn't come. Amara had cancelled this blind date 3 times. Not because she was busy, not because she had somewhere better to be. She had cancelled because she had been in Seoul for 4 months and had not yet figured out how to explain herself to strangers in a language that still sometimes felt like a house she was renting rather than one she lived in. Because blind dates required a version of herself that was easy and legible, and she was neither of those things in Korean or in English on a Tuesday evening when her thesis was stalled, and her advisor had used the word unfocused for the 3rd consecutive meeting, and her grandmother's last video call had ended with the specific silence that meant, "Baby girl, are you lonely?" She was. She did not say so. She had come to Seoul 3 years ago for a reason she had never quite been able to explain to people who needed explanations. She had stood in front of a piece by a Korean artist in an Atlanta gallery and felt in her chest the specific pull of something she needed to understand. Something about negative space, about the weight of what was absent, about what it meant to make something beautiful out of silence. She had applied to the graduate program. She had gotten in. She had told her grandmother on a Sunday video call, and Josephine had looked at her through the screen with the expression she always had when she already knew something Amara was still working out. "Good," she had said. "Go find out what you need to find out." She had not been prepared for how lonely it would be. Not the dramatic loneliness of someone who hated where they were. She loved Seoul. Loved it with the specific passion of someone discovering something they had been unconsciously searching for. She loved the galleries and the light and the pojangmacha near her apartment, where the owner always gave her extra tteokbokki without charging for it. She loved the Han River at night and the specific smell of Seoul after rain, something mineral and electric and alive. She loved the way the city looked from the hill above Naksan Park at dusk when the whole thing went golden and seemed, briefly, to forgive itself for being so relentless. But she was the only one who looked like her in most rooms she entered. She understood more Korean than people assumed, and less than she needed in moments that mattered. She video called her grandmother every Sunday, and there was always a moment, somewhere in those calls, where Josephine would look at her through the screen and say nothing, and Amara would look back and say nothing, and the distance between them, 10,000 miles, 14 hours, everything familiar on one side and everything she was building on the other, would make itself felt, quietly, in the chest, like a hand pressing gently from the inside. She put on the dress she had bought in Myeongdong and took the subway to Gangnam and walked into a restaurant that smelled like doenjang jjigae and expensive candles. And she stopped the moment she saw him. He was not what she had built in her imagination. He was sitting at a table by the window in a suit that had never once in its life been off the rack, and he was completely, absolutely still. The kind of stillness that is not peace, but its opposite. The stillness of a person holding something very large, very carefully, afraid that if they move it will spill. His phone was face up on the table. He was staring at it, and there was a tear on his jaw. One, tracking slowly. He did not wipe it. He did not look around to see if anyone had noticed. He simply sat there and let it exist, which was either the bravest thing she had ever seen or the most broken. And she stood in the middle of the restaurant and felt her chest do the thing it always did. Open, without her permission, toward whoever was hurting. Her grandmother had always called it her gift. Amara had always called it her problem. Tonight, standing in a Gangnam restaurant in a dress she had paid too much for, she watched it happen the way she always watched it happen, the decision being made somewhere beneath her conscious mind before she had any say in it. She sat down across from him. He looked up. The composure arrived in the space of one breath, snapping back into place like a mask he had worn so long it moved like skin. His eyes were dark and precise, and they moved over her face with the focused attention of someone who was cataloguing, rather than simply looking. Amara, she said, because someone had to start, and it was clearly going to be her. Sungmin, low, controlled, a voice that had been trained over years to give nothing away. The waiter appeared. He ordered for both of them without opening the menu, glancing at her once, a quick, questioning look, and she nodded because everything he named was exactly right, which meant either the mutual friend who had arranged this had briefed him thoroughly, or he had found out himself. She was not sure which of those things unsettled her more. She filed it away and said nothing. They ate. The restaurant moved around them. Soft conversation, the clink of glasses, a couple near the window laughing at something private. None of it touched their table. Their table had a different atmosphere entirely. The atmosphere of two people who are both, for entirely different reasons, somewhere else in their heads. Then his phone lit up again. She watched his jaw tighten, watched his hand move toward the phone and then stop, watched him make the decision not to read it, which cost him something. Visible, a tightening around his eyes, a breath taken slightly too carefully. She had composed and discarded 4 different sentences before the one that came out actually came out. You don't have to pretend, she said. I'm a stranger. Strangers are actually easier. He looked at her, and for just a moment, one unguarded, unmanaged moment, he looked at her like a person who was very tired of pretending and had not realized until just now how tired. Here is what she understood without being told. Sungmin had been running his family's empire for 6 years, construction contracts that had physically reshaped Seoul's skyline, import operations moving through Incheon port on paperwork that was always exactly correct and never examined too closely, art galleries that were genuinely beautiful and genuinely successful, and also in the way that beautiful, successful things sometimes are, doing something darker underneath. He wore beautiful suits. He drank whiskey he never finished. His apartment overlooking the Han River was enormous and silent, and full of bookshelves he could never get to the end of because there was always something that needed his attention more. His mother had been the exception to all of it. The one person in his world who looked at him and saw past the composure to whatever was living underneath it, who had brought books to his bedroom door when he was a child and sat with him in the dark when he could not sleep and understood, without being told, that the boy who never showed anything was the boy who felt everything. When she died, he had handled every arrangement, every formality, every condolence from men who offered grief with one hand and calculated advantage with the other. He had sat through all of it without breaking because breaking was not something he allowed himself in front of people who would use it. He had gone home to his apartment afterward and sat in the dark for a very long time, the whiskey untouched, the book unopened, the city glittering below the window, indifferent as always. His father's text had come 3 weeks later. Not a call, a text. The arrangement proceeds. Do not make this complicated. My father, he said, then stopped. Then, he wants me to proceed with an arrangement, a marriage. My mother built it, spent years on it. He looked at the phone. She died in September. Amara set her chopsticks down. Outside, a car horn, the distant bass of music from somewhere. Soul, indifferent and luminous, doing what it always did. And he texted you tonight, she said, while you were sitting here. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment, at the phone, at the careful way he was holding himself together, at the single tear that had dried on his jaw without being acknowledged. And she felt the specific, aching recognition of someone who understood what it cost to hold yourself together in public, when something inside you was breaking. What if, she said slowly, you had a reason to ask for more time? Someone he didn't know about yet. Someone you needed to resolve before you could honor the arrangement. He was completely still, listening. One dinner becomes two. Two becomes a month. A month buys you time to figure out what you actually want. She kept her voice steady. I'm a foreign student. I'm leaving eventually. It stays clean. He studied her with the focused, unblinking attention of a man who had built an empire on reading people correctly. Why, he said, would you do this for someone you have known for 14 minutes? She thought about her grandmother's hands on her face, about the tear on his jaw that he had not wiped, about the specific loneliness of a person who is surrounded by people who need something from them, and has forgotten what it feels like to be seen without an agenda. Because you were crying, she said simply, and you weren't going to tell anyone. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of something neither of them had words for yet, something that was just beginning to exist, tender and dangerous the way new things are dangerous. One dinner, he said finally. Nothing more. One dinner, she agreed. They were both lying. Not to each other, to themselves, and somewhere underneath the lie, in the place where things are simply true before we're ready for them, something had already begun. The arrangement started the following Thursday, a restaurant in Apgujeong this time, a place where Sungmin's father's associates were likely to notice them. Which was the point. Amara had spent 40 minutes that afternoon in a Myeongdong shop, choosing a dress while the sales assistant spoke to her in simplified, slowed-down Korean that Amara understood perfectly and chose not to correct because she was still deciding whether she was amused or tired. She stood outside the restaurant in the cold for 2 minutes, composing herself before going in. She had been composing herself in public for 4 months. She was getting better at it. He was already there. Of course he was already there. He stood when she approached the table, and the gesture was so automatic, so unperformed, not done for the room but simply done, the way you do things that are simply what you do, that it hit her somewhere she had not expected to be hit. The dinner was 8 men and their partners in a private room, with expensive lighting and the kind of conversation that had everything underneath it. Amara watched and listened and said little because that was her strategy in rooms where she was still mapping the terrain. She understood the undercurrents. She had grown up understanding undercurrents, in rooms where people assumed she couldn't, in conversations where the real exchange was happening 2 levels below the words. She had always been able to hear what was actually being said. Halfway through the main course, a heavy-set man in his 60s, the kind of man who had learned to hold power through the specific confidence of someone who has never once had to explain himself, leaned across the table and asked her in Korean, pleasantly, whether she found Seoul difficult to navigate. The implication beneath the question was not subtle. She answered in Korean, fluid, precise, with the specific register of someone who has been understanding you this entire evening and is only now choosing to reveal it. The man's pleasantness recalibrated. Beside her, Sungmin did not smile. His expression did not change, but she felt it. A microscopic shift in the quality of his stillness. A change in the air immediately around him. And she would learn later that this was what it looked like when he was proud of her. Not performing pride, not showing it for the room, just feeling it. Privately. Completely. Afterward, outside, his driver pulling up in the cold, settling over the Apgujeong street, and both of them in the particular silence that comes after an evening of sustained performance, he said, still not looking at her, watching the car approach, "You were extraordinary in there." 4 words, quiet, not presented for effect. She felt them land somewhere in her chest and put down roots. Don't, she told herself. Don't do that. She did that anyway, immediately, without meaning to. She did it the way you do things that are already done before you notice them happening. One dinner became two. Two became a week. The week became the rhythm of her life and soul, and she stopped noticing the moment that happened, because by the time she thought to look, it had already been true for a while. He learned her coffee order, no sugar, too much milk, and had it waiting every time she arrived without mentioning it, without making it a thing, as if making sure she had what she needed was simply the baseline of his existence and required no acknowledgement. The first time she noticed, she looked at the cup and then at him, and he was already looking somewhere else. She opened her mouth and closed it and said nothing, and drank the coffee and felt something warm and inconvenient move through her that she firmly decided to examine later. She brought him books from the university library, not explaining it, just leaving them on the table between them. He started finishing those ones. She found out because he referenced them afterward, casually. Something from page 60, something from the last chapter. And she would realize he had read the whole thing, and something in her chest would do the thing it was increasingly doing around him, the thing she kept deciding to examine later, and never did. The Sunday calls began in the third week, ostensibly to align their stories. The first lasted 40 minutes, the second 2 hours. By the fourth, she had stopped preparing talking points entirely because they were simply talking. He asked about her thesis with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to understand it, not someone performing interest in what she cared about to get closer to her. He pushed her thinking. He asked the question that was slightly sideways from the one she was expecting, the one that opened a door she had not seen. She would hang up and immediately write for an hour because of something he had said, and she was not sure what to do with that, with a man who made her work better simply by paying attention. The Han River at midnight became theirs. She would pull her coat tighter against the cold coming off the water, and he would move slightly closer, not taking her hand, not making it a moment, just closing the distance so his arm was against hers, warm and solid and steady. And she was aware of every centimeter of that contact in a way that made her feel like a teenager, and she told herself it was nothing, and kept walking, and it was absolutely not nothing. He told her about his mother on one of those walks, not all at once, over several nights, in pieces, the way you tell the things that still have sharp edges, the way she had laughed, the books outside his bedroom door, the way she had been the only person in his world who looked at him like a person rather than a function. The specific silence of the apartment in the weeks after she died, not empty silence but the kind that had weight, that pressed against the walls, that made him aware of every room she was no longer in. He told her facing the river, not looking at her, and she walked beside him, and let it be as large as it was. Let it take up all the space it needed. Did not try to smooth it or redirect it, or make it more comfortable. When he finished, she did not say, "I'm sorry," or "she sounds wonderful," or any of the things people say. She just walked beside him in the silence and let him have it. After a while, he said quietly, still looking at the river, "You do that." "Do what?" "Make room." A pause. Most people, when you say something that hurts, they immediately try to make it smaller. You just let it be the size it is. She did not say anything, but something shifted between them on that stretch of riverbank, quietly, completely, in a way that could not be undone. And she felt it shift and kept walking and thought, "I am in so much trouble, and I have been for a while." Yonha walked into her life not through Sungmin's world, but through hers. On a Wednesday evening in November at a Mapo gallery opening for a sculptor whose work she had been studying for her thesis, pieces made from industrial cable and raw metal that somehow, improbably, arrived at something that felt like tenderness. She moved through the space the way she always moved through galleries, slowly, close, with the total private attention of someone for whom looking is not a performance but a necessity. She was standing in front of a large piece near the back wall, steel cable twisted into a form that from certain angles looked almost exactly like an embrace, when she became aware of someone beside her. Tall, sharp, jaw, dark eyes doing exactly what hers were doing. Actually looking, not performing looking. One streak of blonde cut through his dark hair like it had always been there, and he had never once thought to change it. He was looking at the sculpture with the focused stillness of someone who was genuinely seeing it, not positioning himself in relation to it, not preparing to say something clever, just seeing it. They stood together in silence for almost a full minute. In a room full of people performing appreciation, that silence was unusual enough to feel like something. "It's about his father," she said finally, in Korean, nodding at the piece. "The cable is the same gauge used in the factory his father worked in for 30 years. The piece is called Hyung, elder brother. But it's not about a brother at all." He turned and looked at her, not the way men sometimes looked at her in Seoul, with that particular mixture of curiosity and recalibration that her presence occasionally produced in rooms where she was the only one who looked like her. He looked at her the way people look at something that has surprised them in a way they are genuinely glad about. "You're writing about him," he said. "My thesis." "What's your argument?" She told him. The full version, the idea she had been building for months about this generation of Korean artists, and what they were doing with inherited silence, with the weight of what their parents had survived and never named. He listened without interrupting, and without the slightly distant look that people got when she went too deep into the work. He was fully there. When she finished, he said, "What about artists who inherit the opposite? Not silence, but too much noise. Everything said, loudly, with no room for them inside it. Do they appear in your argument?" She had not considered that. She would think about it for 3 days. "Yonha," he said. Just his name. "Amara." They moved through the rest of the gallery together, without deciding to. The natural gravity of two people who are interested in the same thing, and have found each other in a room full of people, interested in appearing interested. He asked questions that moved her thinking sideways. She said things that made him pause. Outside afterward, on a Mapo street with November settling cold around them, he looked at her and said simply, "I'd like to continue this conversation. Not can I have your number? Not we should get drinks sometime. Just, this is worth more. I want more of it." She gave him her number. It felt, in that moment, entirely reasonable. What she found out over the following 2 weeks arrived like stones into still water, each one changing the surface before the rings from the last one had finished moving. Yonha had built his organization from nothing in 7 years, not from inheritance or connection, but from the specific, relentless intelligence of someone who had grown up watching the port at Incheon and understanding from childhood how things moved and who controlled the points of access, and where the value actually lived versus where it appeared to live. He had taken that understanding and built something faster and more aggressive than anything Sungmin's family had constructed, the kind of organization that made older empires nervous because it did not play by the established rhythms. He was not cruel. He was precise. His people understood the difference. The people who had underestimated him had generally understood it too late. He had been at the gallery opening for business, a meeting with a collector whose money moved through the art world in ways that were useful to him. He had finished in 20 minutes and was heading for the exit when a woman across the room stopped him. Not by calling out, not by doing anything, simply by standing in front of a sculpture with a quality of attention so complete and so private that it made everything else in the room seem slightly less real. He had gone to stand beside her because he could not find a reason not to. He found out about Sungmin on day 3. His people had done routine background and come back almost apologetically with the connection. He had sat with that for 4 days, stared at it, turned it over, put it down and picked it up again. On day 5, he texted, "What are you working on?" He told himself it was useful. Information. He was lying and he knew it, and he sent the text anyway because the alternative was walking away from something that felt, inexplicably, necessary. And Yonha did not walk away from necessary things. It was the core of him, the thing that had built everything he had. He was apparently unable to make an exception even when the necessary thing was a woman connected to the one man in Seoul, whose orbit he was supposed to stay clear of. The weeks that followed split Amara into two maps. Sungmin on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sunday mornings. The Han River, the accumulated warmth of months of being known by someone who paid attention without being asked. And now layered over that, shifting the texture of everything, the new geography of Yonha. Friday afternoons in a Hongdae coffee place where she could spread her thesis notes, and he would read them and ask the question she had not yet thought to ask herself. Conversations that expanded rather than reflected. A different kind of being seen. Not the deep, accumulated knowing of Sungmin, but something more immediate, more disruptive. Like a window opened in a room she had not realized was getting airless. She had not told Sungmin about Yonha. She told herself this was because their arrangement had no rule against other friendships. She was allowed Friday afternoons. She had done nothing that required disclosure. She told herself this on a Thursday evening, sitting across from Sungmin at their restaurant by the Han River, while the lights moved on the water and her coffee was exactly right and he was asking about her thesis with the genuine attention she had come to need the way she needed air, and she looked at his face and felt the full weight of the lie. Not the lie to him, but the lie to herself, which was that Friday afternoons were simply intellectual companionship and nothing more. They were not nothing more. She knew that. She was choosing not to know it. Yonha, for his part, had moved his Thursday meetings to Wednesday. He did not examine why, did not look too closely at the fact that Thursday was Sungmin's day, and that moving away from it had been instinctive, immediate, the specific instinct of a man who was claiming territory, without admitting that was what he was doing. He was patient with her in a way that was entirely new to him. Not strategic patience, genuine patience. The recognition that she was not a position to be taken, but a person who was navigating something complicated, and that the wrong move would not just lose him what they had, but damage something he had no replacement for. The night her grandmother called from Atlanta to tell her about the fall. Just a precaution. I'm already home. Don't you dare panic. Amara sat down on the floor of her apartment because her legs simply stopped. Her grandmother's voice was thin in a way it had never been, and she was 10,000 miles away in a city she loved that was not home, and the distance between her and the person who had built her felt suddenly, viscerally, like a physical weight pressing on her sternum, like something you could choke on. She did not call Sungmin. It did not even occur to her to call Sungmin. Their arrangement did not include this. She had never agreed to be the kind of person he came to in moments like this. She sat on her floor with her phone pressed against her chest and the Seoul night outside her window and breathed. An hour later, someone knocked on her door. She opened it, and he was there, jacket still on. No explanation of how he knew, she found. Out later, his driver had passed her building and seen her light on at midnight and called him. He looked at her face in the doorway, and he did not ask what was wrong, because he could already see what was wrong. And he came inside without being invited, and sat on her couch and was simply, completely present. He did not say she'll be fine, did not say try not to worry, did not say anything at all useful or useless. He sat there in her small Mapo apartment with its thesis notes and its art prints and its convenience store containers she hadn't thrown away yet. And he was there, and she sat beside him and cried in the uncomplicated, unguarded way. You can only cry when you feel genuinely, completely safe. She fell asleep at some point, against his shoulder, without meaning to. When she woke, it was early morning and grey light was coming through her window, and he was still there, asleep himself, head tilted back, the book from his jacket pocket open on his chest. She looked at him for a long time, at his face relaxed in sleep, younger than it ever looked when he was awake and managing himself. At the book, one she had brought him from the library, at her apartment around them, which felt, with him in it, less like somewhere she was borrowing and more like somewhere she actually lived. She did not look away from the feeling this time. She had been so careful not to look directly at it, the way you don't look directly at something bright. But sitting there in the early morning while he slept with her library book on his chest, she let herself see it, fully, all of it. Let herself feel the full size and weight of it. She loved him, not the performance, not the arrangement, not the version of him that existed in restaurants in front of people who needed to believe something. She loved the man who had driven across the city without being called, and moved slightly closer on cold riverbanks, and made room in his silence for everything she needed to say. She loved him in the specific, irreversible way that you love someone once you have seen them be genuinely, unguardedly themselves. She got up carefully, made coffee, ordered it correctly for both of them, and stood at her window and looked at Seoul and thought, with the specific clarity of someone who has just run out of ways to avoid something. What am I going to do? He woke to the smell of it, found her at the small table pretending to work on her thesis, looked at the 2 coffee cups, looked at her, sat down, drank, and then reached out and picked up one of her thesis pages and read it, slowly, genuinely, and said, "Your central argument is becoming something real." "It was real before," she said. "It's becoming something else," he said. "Something larger." He set the page down, looked at her with the expression he kept so carefully managed in every other room, and that he had, over months, stopped managing with her. Like something that has been growing in the dark and has finally run out of room. She stopped breathing for a moment. He stood, put on his jacket, and paused in the doorway, hand on the frame, back to her, and said, "You can tell me. Whatever you're not saying, there's room for it." He left. She sat in the silence he left behind and pressed both hands flat on her thesis notes, and breathed in and breathed out, and thought, this arrangement was supposed to have edges and it doesn't anymore, and I don't know what to do about that. 2 weeks later, the Liam Museum, the Haig-Yang installation, hundreds of Venetian blinds suspended at different heights, light moving through them constantly, the whole thing shifting every time you moved, meaning something different depending on where you stood and what you brought to it. She walked in and the breath left her body. Yonha was already there. He watched her walk in and lose her breath, and he said nothing. Let her have it. This was what she had come to understand about him. He made room for what she was, experiencing without inserting himself into it. A different kind of attention than Sungmin's. Not better, not worse. Different in the specific way that 2 real things can be different, each of them complete, each of them true. They moved through the installation. The crowd pressed them close. She was mid-sentence about displaced domesticity and the specific politics of objects designed to control light being used to create freedom. And she felt him looking at her and lost the sentence. Genuinely lost it mid-thought. And found it again and finished it and did not look at him. Amara. His voice was low, not controlled the way Sungmin's was controlled. Just personal. The register he used when it was only the 2 of them. She looked at him. I know about Sungmin, he said. I have known since the 3rd day. I am telling you now because I do not want there to be things between us that aren't said. The light moved through the blinds around them. Someone nearby laughed. What is it you want, she said carefully, that requires this conversation right now? That expression, the one that meant he was about to say something true, he had not entirely prepared himself for. More Fridays, he said. More of whatever happens when we're in a room together. And I think you should know exactly who I am when I tell you that. He told her. Everything. His organization, the territory, the 3-year cold peace with Sungmin's family, and what it was built on. The things he had built and the methods he had used to build them, and the parts he was not proud of and would not apologize for. He gave her the unedited version, and she understood that this honesty was costing him something. Not because he was ashamed of what he was, but because he knew it might cost him her. He was choosing to tell her anyway. She was quiet for a long time when he finished. You knew from the beginning and you came anyway, she said. Yes. Why? He looked at her with everything available on his face. No management, no performance, just Yonha, direct and complete. Because you stood in front of that sculpture and saw what it was actually about, he said. Because when you spoke, it was the truest thing said in that room all evening. And because I have looked for a reason to walk away from that, and I cannot find one. I have tried. She looked at the Venetian blinds. at the light moving through them. Constant, shifting, meaning something different from every angle. Like understanding that was not yet finished but was happening visibly in the movement toward it. Both things were true. That was the part she kept arriving at. Both things were entirely, impossibly, simultaneously true. What she felt for Sung-min, that enormous, months-old, terrifying thing she had finally stopped pretending not to feel. And this other thing with Yeon-ha, this different and disruptive and equally real thing that had been growing on Friday afternoons in a way she had not been honest with herself about. She stayed in the installation until the museum closed and they walked out into the Itaewon cold and parted ways. And she took the subway home and sat in her apartment in the dark, without turning the light on for a long time. She sat in the dark in her Seoul apartment 10,000 miles from her grandmother and thought, I am the girl who reached out her hand to help someone, and now both her hands are full, and she does not know how to put anything down. The morning the fracture began was a Saturday in December when Seoul had its first real cold snap of the winter, and Amara was in the back office of the Mapo Gallery, working through archive materials with a coffee going cold at her elbow, and she heard voices in the gallery space and her body went still before her mind caught up. Sung-min's father. She had met him twice. Both times she had understood that he saw her the way he saw most things, as either useful or not useful, and that she was, currently in the second category, tolerated only because his son had made her briefly necessary. He had the specific presence of a man who had learned to make every room smaller when he entered it. The back office had thin walls. The girl is a complication. The O arrangement cannot wait. Tell Sung-min that complications have a way of resolving themselves when they stop being convenient. A murmured agreement from whoever was with him. She does not understand what she has walked into. Make sure that continues. Amara sat very still in the back office with her archive materials and her cold coffee, and felt the specific cold of those words move through her. Not through her skin, but through something deeper. The specific cold of realizing you have been inside a story, much larger than the part you were shown, and that the people who built the story have always seen you as a piece to be moved, rather than a person to be considered. She drove home, sat on her apartment floor, did not cry. She was past crying. She was somewhere further than crying, in the specific clarifying place that comes after you have understood something you cannot unknow, where everything gets very quiet and very clear. She was not a complication. She was a person. She had flown 10,000 miles from her grandmother's house, and her grandmother's voice, and the only home she had ever known to be in this city that she loved. And she had tried to help a man who was crying at a restaurant table, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, she had become a complication. A thing to be managed. A problem to be resolved. Sung-min called that evening. She answered. His voice was careful the way it got when he was paying the closest attention. Are you all right? Tired, she said. The pause before he said goodnight was 4 full seconds. She heard the entire question he was not asking in those 4 seconds. She let it go unanswered. The next morning he knocked on her door at 8 a.m. She opened it and he was standing there with 2 coffees and a bag from the bakery across the city. The one she had mentioned exactly once in passing 6 weeks ago. And she looked at the bag and felt something crack open in her chest so suddenly and so completely that she had to grip the doorframe. He had gone across the city before 8 in the morning for red bean pastry, because she had mentioned it once. She let him in. They sat at her table. He spread her thesis notes between them, and read them and asked her about her argument with the genuine focused interest that she had come to need, that she had come to depend on more than she had ever intended to depend on anything. They talked for an hour. He did not mention his father, did not mention the arrangement, did not acknowledge any of the machinery that was grinding against both of them beneath the surface of everything. When he left, he stopped in the doorway, and she thought he was going to say something real, something that cracked the careful surface they had both been maintaining. And instead, he said quietly, without turning, "Whatever my father said, you are not a complication to me." He left. She stood in the middle of her apartment in the silence he left behind, and pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed and thought, this is the part where everything breaks. I can feel it. This is the part where everything breaks and I cannot stop it. The crisis did not announce itself. It came quietly, the way the worst things always come, as a polite request, a car door held open. Two men who were not aggressive about it, who were almost courteous, which made it more frightening than aggression would have been. A Saturday morning outside the Mafia gallery. She read them in 4 seconds. She went with them because the alternative was worse, and she needed to understand the shape of this before she reacted to it. They put her in a conference room in an Itaewon office building, legitimate building, good. Furniture, a view of the city that was almost beautiful, coffee that she did not touch. A well-dressed, unremarkable man came in and explained, with the courtesy of someone who believes the threat is already made and does not need performance, what they wanted. Not information. Leverage. Her visibility in both men's lives was the mechanism. Her fear was the pressure point. She looked at him across the table. She thought about Sungmin's hand on her doorframe. About Yonha saying, "I want to know what you want," before anything else. About her grandmother pressing both hands around her face in an Atlanta kitchen that smelled like Sunday morning and saying, "You have always been too soft for your own good, and I hope you never change." She picked up the coffee, drank it, set it down. "You've made a significant miscalculation," she said. He waited. "You've assumed that using me as leverage slows them down." She held his gaze. "But to know that I matter to them, you had to understand what they feel. And if you understand what they feel, you've just given two men who have been maintaining a careful peace for 3 years the exact same reason to end it. Together. About you." He looked at her. Something in his pleasantness shifted, recalibrated. "They're enemies," he said. "They were enemies," she said. "Before me." Sungmin found out she was missing in 20 minutes. He was in a car heading toward Itaewon in 30. Yonha found out 17 minutes after Sungmin and was already closer. He arrived at the building first by 4 minutes and was standing in the lobby when Sungmin walked through the door. They looked at each other. 3 years of managed distance and territorial boundaries, and the cold language of two men who had chosen coexistence over conflict. 3 years of everything except this, facing each other in a lobby with the same information and the same objective, and nothing between them except the truth of why they were both here. Yonha said, "8th floor." Sungmin nodded once. They went up together. What happened on the 8th floor was fast and specific, and without hesitation. The faction had miscalculated in precisely the way Amara had told them they would, had believed that the tension between Sungmin and Yonha would slow the response, would create hesitation, would give them room. Had not understood that the same woman who had undone both men separately had, in the act of being threatened, made them briefly, devastatingly, entirely unified. The conference room door opened. Amara looked at the doorway. She saw them both, standing there together, and the look on their faces when they saw her, when their eyes found her face and confirmed she was all right, was the kind of look you cannot manufacture and cannot control, the kind that comes from somewhere beneath all the strategy and management and composure, from the place where things are simply, irrevocably true. She felt it move through her like the first warm day, after a winter that went on too long. The man across from her looked at the doorway, at Sungmin, at Yonha, understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has run out of positions, exactly how badly he had miscalculated. "You were right," he said to Amara quietly. "Yes," she said, "I was." It was late when the three of them were finally alone. A street in Itaewon, the city doing what it always did around them, luminous and indifferent and alive. The cold was sharp and clean. Somewhere close a restaurant was closing, the sound of it drifting past. Chairs, voices, the end of an evening. They stood there, the three of them. No arrangement, no performance, no version of themselves designed for any room but this one. Amara spoke first because she had always been the one who spoke first when it mattered, even when it cost her, especially when it cost her, because her grandmother had built her that way and she had never once, in 26 years, managed to be different. She looked at Sungmin, really looked, at the man who had learned her coffee order without being asked, and driven across the city for red bean pastry, and sat in the dark beside her while she cried, and never once made it about himself. At the man who read her thesis upside down and called it something real. At the man who had, in a restaurant 4 months ago, let one tear track down his jaw in public and not wiped it away. "What you said in my apartment," she said. Her voice was steady. She was making it steady. "That what you feel is not part of the arrangement. I need you to know." She stopped, breathed. "I need you to know it is not one-sided. It has not been for a very long time. I just didn't know how to say it because saying it felt like stepping off something without knowing what was below." He looked at her and she saw it, the full, unmanaged version of him, the one that only came when he had run out of composure to deploy. And it was the most devastating thing she had ever seen on a human face. Not happiness, not relief. Something quieter and more irreversible than either of those things. The expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been told he does not have to anymore. She turned to Yonha, at the man who had stood beside her in a gallery and asked what she thought before he offered what he thought, who had told her the truth about himself before she asked for it, who had looked at her from the beginning like she was something worth being honest with. "And you," she said, "walking into that gallery and actually seeing what I was seeing, and then being honest with me even when it cost you." She shook her head. "I can't unfeel whatever this is. I have tried. I don't want to anymore." Yonha was completely still, his eyes on her face with the complete, unperformative attention she had come to know. The attention that said, "I am here, all of me, for whatever you are about to say. I can't give either of you a clean answer tonight," she said. "I don't have one. What I have is this city, this work, this, whatever this is that the three of us have made without meaning to. And I'm not going to reduce it to a choice while I'm standing on a street in Itaewon after the worst Saturday of my life." Sungmin looked at her for a long time. Then quietly, the voice he used when something cost him, and he was spending it anyway. "I'm not asking you to choose. I told you I have no right to ask that." A pause. "I'm asking you not to disappear. That's different." She looked at Yonha. "I have never asked you for anything you weren't willing to give," he said. His voice was low, direct, everything he was. "I'm not starting now." A beat. "But I need you to know I'm not walking away either, whatever that means for what comes next." The street held the three of them in its cold and its light. Seoul breathed in all directions. The Han River 3 blocks west, the restaurants closing, the city that had never once been genuinely indifferent to her even when she had told herself it was. She did not give them an answer. She did not have one yet. She was honest enough to know that and honest enough not to pretend otherwise. But she also, for the first time in 4 months, did not feel like she was holding something too large for her arms alone. 3 months later, Incheon Airport. She had bought the ticket on a night when clarity had arrived the way it sometimes arrives. Sudden, cold, slightly cruel. The clarity was this: she could not build a life inside someone else's world. She had come to Seoul for art. She had found her thesis, her argument, the understanding she had crossed 10,000 miles to reach. Her advisor had called it genuinely important work. She had a defense date. She had, for the first time since October, a path forward that was entirely, cleanly her own. She needed to go home. To her grandmother. To the house that smelled like shea butter and Sunday morning. To herself. The self that existed before Seoul had rearranged her so completely. She sometimes stood in her apartment and could not remember who she had been when she arrived. She had not told either of them. She had written the message to Songmin 4 times and deleted it 4 times. She had started a text to Yonha and stared at it until the screen went dark. She had told herself she would tell them in person, and then she had not, because in person would have been impossible, and she had not trusted herself to go through with it if she had seen their faces first. She was a coward. She knew it. She was at the airport anyway. 1 suitcase, 1 ticket, the departures gate 20 feet away, and the flight attendant at the desk beginning to look at her with the professional patience of someone whose patience was running out. Amara. She closed her eyes. opened them. Sung-min was at the far end of the terminal. No jacket, tie pulled loose. The specific look of a man who had come here fast from somewhere that mattered more than his composure. And Sung-min's composure was the thing he had protected most carefully for most of his adult life. The thing that had kept him safe in rooms that would have used anything else against him, and it was gone. Completely gone. He was standing at the far end of the terminal looking at her with his whole face available, and it was the most undefended she had ever seen him. And it broke something open in her chest so quickly she pressed her hand flat against it. He did not move, did not call out again, just stood there and let her see him. The way he had let that tear track down his jaw in a Gangnam restaurant 4 months ago without wiping it away. The same choice. The same bravery or brokenness or both. Just letting her see. Then from the other direction, Yeon-ha, also here. Also breathing hard, Yeon-ha, who moved through every room with perfect economy, who never wasted motion, who she had never once seen bees. Anything other than precisely composed, breathing hard, the blonde streak catching the flat terminal light, his eyes finding her immediately across the distance the way they always found her immediately across every distance. He stopped when he saw Sung-min. Sung-min looked at him. The 3-year history of everything they were to each other moved between them in a single look. All of it, the territory, the cold peace, the years of managed distance, and now this impossible point of convergence, this woman at gate 14 with a one-way ticket in her hand, who had walked into both their lives through a small act of kindness, and rearranged everything. Then both of them looked at her. Amara looked at her ticket. The paper was soft at the edges from how long she had been holding it. She looked at Sung-min, at the man who had made sure she was never cold, never without, never alone, who had read her thesis upside down and called it something real, who had asked her to stay with the specific humility of a man who was not used to asking for anything. She looked at Yeon-ha, at the man who had told her the truth about himself before she asked, who had moved his meetings to Wednesday without explaining why, who had said, "I want to know what you want," before anything else, and had meant it completely. She looked at the gate, her fire tongue, the one her grandmother had built into her, the one that had never once failed her, that had spoken when it mattered in every room that had tried to make her small, had nothing. Not because she did not know what she felt. She knew exactly what she felt. She had known for a long time. But standing exactly here, 20 feet from a door, soul behind her, 10,000 miles of home ahead of her, and 2 men at opposite ends of a terminal who had both, in their completely different and equally real ways, shown her what it meant to be truly, fully seen. She understood something she had not understood before. Some things do not resolve. Some feelings do not choose between themselves. Some loves do not cancel each other out, no matter how much easier it would be if they did. The flight attendant said her name. The gate was open. And Amara stood completely still in Incheon Airport with a ticket going soft in her hand and felt the full, irreducible, impossible weight of being exactly here, caught between what she came for and what she found, between the life she planned and the one that had quietly, completely, without her permission, already begun. If this story found you when you needed it, give it a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming. Because here is what you don't know yet. 3 days after the airport, Amara's phone rings. Unknown number. She almost doesn't answer. When she does, the voice on the other end is not Sung-min. It is not Yeon-ha. It is a woman. Calm, precise. And she says 7 words that change everything. The arrangement was never about you. Until now. Part 2 is coming. And nothing that happens in it will look like what you expect.